In the first half of the 19th century, the anti-slavery North and the slave-owning South were on a collision course. As the abolitionists in the North gave increasingly organized assistance to the escaped slaves, their Underground Railroad became a catalyst for the national crisis over human freedom.
I'm on my way, red car, I'm on my way, I'm on my way.
The station masters and conductors on the Underground Railroad stood up against slavery, most pivotally in Ohio, by helping the fugitive slaves on their journey north, disrupting the practice of slavery, enlarging the gap between North and South, and making civil war inevitable. By taking a stand against intolerable cruelty, the station masters of Ohio in particular made a critical contribution to the ending of slavery. Slavery in North America began in 1565 when Spanish colonists brought Africans to work in Florida. The first slaves introduced into English colonies were brought to Jamestown in 1619. From the very beginning, slaves tried to escape the harsh life of beatings and long hours in the scorching fields, and from being sold and separated and living under horrible conditions with no pay. They were ashamed to be owned by white men and felt they had every right to be free. Cotton was the main product of the South, and most slaves were used on cotton plantations. By the 1860s, the South had around 4 million slaves. From the very beginning, however, slaves attempted to win their freedom. Some slipped south to Mexico, where they were treated as equals and allowed to own land. Some escaped slaves were helped by Native Americans and became part of their tribes. You can still find Native Americans with African ancestry today. The northern colonies and later northern states were not always opposed to slavery. In 1712, Quaker-dominated Pennsylvania was the first northern colony to ban the importation of slaves, and in 1777, Vermont became the first state to ban slavery itself. After the Revolution, most northern states gradually abolished slavery. By 1786, 14 northern states had abolished slavery. When fugitive slaves got to the North, they usually felt safe. That is until 1793, when the United States enacted the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave hunters to recapture slaves that had escaped to the northern states, even though slavery was slowly being outlawed there. But the law was not uniformly enforced, and slaves were generally safe in the northern states living among whites. By the 1780s, Quakers started the first abolitionist societies in North America. Through the work of Frederick Douglass and other abolitionist speakers, whites began to understand the horrors of slavery, and support for the escaped slaves increased. In the 1820s, a loosely organized network began to develop in the North among abolitionist whites and blacks who helped the escaped slaves from the South. This network became known as the Underground Railroad, a term first used by newspapers in the 1840s. The Underground Railroad was a complex network of people, places, and codes. One way people on the Underground Railroad communicated was through quilts, whose patterns included secret messages. Artist Chosani Dean finds inspiration in the Underground Railroad quilts for her art and ceramic tile making.
What I'm most interested in about the Underground Railroad and those quilts is that the simple use of a domestic everyday activity had a secret code and a double existence in providing information, messages, and a pathway to freedom for people who were enslaved. And through this, simple practice that a group of women got together to do, the legacy is my freedom. And I feel that it's just in my soul and my interest and my heart to keep this legacy alive.
The people who helped the slaves on the road as they traveled north were called conductors. The most famous conductor is Harriet Tubman, who slipped back into the South 11 times to guide more than 300 slaves to the North. All the conductors were subject to execution if caught, and suffered many hungry, uncomfortable nights in the woods with the escapees. Though conductors helped slaves on the road, the fugitives still needed a place to stay. Wherever they saw a light in the window of a house, they knew there was a station master there willing to take them in. The phrase that let everyone on the Underground Railroad know that they were safe was, "friend of a friend." Station masters would hide escapees in cellars and secret rooms.
Most of the Underground Railroad information we have suggests that they were actually being hidden in the houses in many cases. And so we have looked at some evidences of artifacts that have been found inside of old houses where, especially around the center stack, where it would have been a little bit warmer, and there were trap doors and places to hide people, but keep them warm.
The Underground Railroad became even more important in 1850 when a new and stronger fugitive slave law was signed by President Fillmore. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which created a stronger enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, the housing and helping of slaves on the road to freedom became a great risk to the station masters themselves. After that, not only did escaped slaves have to get to the northern states, they had to escape all the way to Canada. Many routes on the Underground Railroad led through Ohio, which had many courageous station masters and conductors who took a stand to help fugitive slaves in spite of the danger to themselves. One of the most famous routes on the Underground Railroad led through the border town of Ripley, Ohio. Almost all the residents of Ripley were abolitionists who helped escaped slaves. Presbyterian minister John Rankin was one of the most famous station masters in Ripley. A light in Reverend Rankin's window was a beacon of hope for slaves who were able to escape across the Ohio River. Harry Beecher Stowe was another important contributor to the Underground Railroad while she was living in Ohio. Stowe lived in Cincinnati between 1832 and 1850, and while there she met with John Rankin and other Ohio abolitionists. Her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written in 1852, movingly described the plight of slaves and the struggles of the fugitives.
We don't know of a direct effect that the Uncle Tom's Cabin affected the Underground Railroad. We know that the book galvanized the abolitionist movement.
It was based on stories she had heard in Ohio, and it helped build sympathy among the northern whites for the abolition of slavery. She brought the struggles of slavery and the terrors of running away into the homes of the northern whites. When Abraham Lincoln first met Stowe, he was reported to have said, "So this is the little lady who started this big war." Another famous station master and conductor on the Underground Railroad in Ripley was the escaped slave and blacksmith named John Parker. Every night he secretly crossed the Ohio River into slave-owning Kentucky to find escaped slaves and bring them across to freedom in Ripley. From 1822 to 1863, the town of Ripley sheltered more than 2,000 escaped slaves. John Parker later invented and patented machines to harvest cotton which replaced slaves in the fields. He valued education, and was known to have said that if any one of his children followed in his profession and became blacksmiths, he would disown them. Parker sent 2 of his 6 children to Oberlin College. Oberlin, Ohio was another important site of abolitionism and a stop on the Underground Railroad.
The reason that Oberlinians believed that slavery was wrong is because they believed it was a sin. One of the things about Oberlin that was so important in its role as a part of the Underground Railroad was, again, there was a large, free community of color here already. And while Oberlinians would know who was a long-term resident and who was unfamiliar, many other people, slave catchers coming to the town, wouldn't know the difference between a free person and a fugitive.
John Brown, one of the most famous and radical abolitionists, also lived in Ohio at one time. Both Brown and his father were active station masters on the Underground Railroad, and Brown's father was a trustee of Oberlin College. Brown believed abolitionists should do more than help slaves one by one to freedom, but that slaves should revolt against their masters. On October 16, 1859, Brown and 24 committed followers, including many Ohio abolitionists and some veterans of the Wellington Rescue, attempted to start a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, by seizing a federal weapons arsenal. In retrospect, the station masters and the abolitionist movement in Ohio played a key role in forcing the United States toward a final end to slavery by keeping the injustice of slavery before the nation. On April 12, 1861, the new Confederacy of the Southern States attacked Fort Sumter. By the end of the war, more than 500,000 Americans were casualties of the conflict, but the South would not back down and they would not give up their slaves. So, in the middle of the war, on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in territories held by the Confederates. Although Lincoln had no power to free slaves in the rebellious Confederacy, his declaration encouraged Southern slaves to escape and enlist in the black regiments of the Union and fight to defeat the Confederacy. After the war, on December 6, 1865, slavery was finally abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. The courage, ingenuity, and honor of the station masters and conductors of the Underground Railroad continue to inspire people to stand up for their beliefs today.